On Christmas, my son handed me an envelope. Your gift, a ticket to a nursing home. You leave tomorrow. Congratulations! His wife burst out laughing. But when I pulled out my own surprise that I had been keeping in my purse since morning, their faces went pale. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I knew my son. That thought still sits with me sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the radiator ticks and the shadows on the ceiling look exactly the way they did when Brad was 7 years old and I sat beside his bed reading to him until he fell asleep. I used to know the smell of his hair and the sound of his laugh and the particular way he lied, the little sideways glance, the too quick smile. I thought I knew all of it. I thought that kind of knowing was permanent, the way you think a house is permanent until the foundation shifts. My name is Marjorie Ellis. I am 72 years old. I lived for a time, in the house my late husband Gerald and I bought in 1987, a white colonial on Sycamore Drive in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. Gerald died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 41 days from diagnosis to the end. After that, I kept the house, kept the garden, kept myself busy the way widows do when they are determined not to become a burden to anyone. I volunteered at the library on Tuesdays. I walked 3 miles every morning. I had my book club, my neighbor Ruth, my cat Oliver, and my herb garden. I was not lonely. I was careful not to be lonely. Brad was our only child. I was proud of him in the uncomplicated way mothers are proud before they start to see clearly. He worked in insurance, middle management, nothing spectacular but steady. He married Tiffany 8 years ago. Tiffany was 34, bottle blonde, and wore the kind of smile that arrived slightly too late, like a translation from another language. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I brought casseroles. I remembered birthdays. I asked about her sister's children by name. She was always perfectly polite, and I always left their house feeling faintly erased. The first warning sign, I think, was the property tax question. It was a Sunday in March, 14 months before Christmas. Brad and Tiffany had come for lunch, and I'd made pot roast the way Gerald always loved it. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and Brad asked, almost casually, almost as though it had just occurred to him, what I thought the house was worth these days. I said I hadn't thought about it much. He said a neighbor down the street had sold for $480. He said the market was very strong right now. He said, and here he used a word that snagged in me like a fishhook, manageable. He said a smaller place might be more manageable for a woman my age. I changed the subject, but I remembered. 2 months later, Tiffany began forwarding me articles. Printed out, tucked into envelopes, mailed with a return address sticker that had a little sunflower on it. Articles about seniors and isolation. Articles about fall risks in older homes. One about a woman in Michigan who had died alone and wasn't found for a week. I read every one. I filed every one. Then came the visits from Brad's financial advisor friend, a man named Derek who wore loafers without socks even in November, and who asked, over coffee I had made for him, whether I had considered a trust structure that might protect my assets while allowing family members to assist with management. I said I would think about it. I did not offer him more coffee. I was not frightened yet. I was paying attention. And then came Christmas. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine. I had decorated the way I always did, the wreath on the door, the nativity Gerald's mother had brought from Pennsylvania, the string of white lights along the mantel. Brad and Tiffany arrived at noon. She was wearing a red dress and very high heels for a family lunch, and I noticed she kept glancing at the living room the way you glance at a space you're already mentally rearranging. We ate. We opened gifts. And then Brad reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and produced a white envelope and held it out to me with a smile I had never seen on his face before. Wide. Satisfied. Like a man who has already won. "Mom," he said, "your gift this year is a little different." I took the envelope, I opened it. Inside was a printed brochure for a place called Meadow Pines Assisted Living and a letter confirming a room reservation in my name and a move-in date of December 26th. Tomorrow. "You're going to love it," Tiffany said, and laughed. It was a bright, clean, merciless laugh. I looked at my son's face. I looked at his wife's face. I set the brochure on the table very gently, the way you set down something that doesn't belong to you. And then I reached into my handbag. My hand was in my handbag. I felt the edge of the envelope in there. My envelope, the one I had carried since 9 that morning, the one I had driven to pick up on Christmas Eve when most people were wrapping presents and I was sitting in a lawyer's office on 5th Street making sure every signature was witnessed and notarized and correct. My fingers touched the paper and something in me went absolutely still, but I did not take it out yet. Not yet. I looked at Brad. He was still smiling that new smile, the one I didn't recognize. Tiffany was refilling her wine glass. The Christmas lights blinked along the mantel. Oliver the cat had retreated under the armchair, which was, I had come to believe, a reliable indicator of character in a room. "I'll think about it," I said. Brad's smile flickered. "Mom, the reservation is already made. The deposit is paid." "Then they have your deposit," I said pleasantly and excused myself to the kitchen. Let me go back 3 months, because that is where this story really begins. It was September, a Tuesday, the day after I had received Tiffany's 4th envelope. This one containing an article about senior financial exploitation and how families could protect elderly parents by consolidating assets. I sat at Gerald's old desk in the study with all 4 envelopes spread in front of me, and I made myself look at them not as the gestures of a worried son, but as what they actually were: a campaign, methodical, patient, building toward something. Gerald used to say I was the most organized person he had ever known. He meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one. I got out a yellow legal pad and I made a list. What they wanted was obvious: the house. The house was worth somewhere between $480,000 and $500,000. I also had a savings account with Gerald's life insurance settlement, just over $200,000, and a modest pension from my 30 years as a school librarian. If I were in a care facility, unable to manage my own affairs, if Brad had power of attorney, all of that could be redirected, managed, protected. The language they would use would be loving. I wrote the number at the top of the page. Nearly $700,000. That was what my son saw when he looked at me. I sat with that for a long time. Then I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. I was afraid in a way I hadn't been since the 41 days of Gerald's dying. That specific cold fear that comes when you realize that something you thought was solid is not solid at all. I was afraid of what it meant that my son's eyes had become financial instruments. I was afraid of being alone in a facility I hadn't chosen, stripped of my house and my garden and my cat and my Tuesday mornings at the library, dependent on strangers, visited occasionally by people who held my legal documents. I cried that Tuesday night, thoroughly and privately into a dish towel in the kitchen because I did not want to cry in a room where I would have to face the crying again in the morning. And then I stopped crying, and I made another list. The first person I called on Wednesday morning was Ruth, my neighbor who is 70 and sharp as a tack and whose late husband had been a county judge. Ruth listened to everything I told her without interrupting, which is one of the many reasons I have trusted her for 30 years. "You need an elder law attorney," she said, "not a general practice lawyer, an elder law specialist. Do you want a name?" I did. His name was Franklin Reeves, and his office was on 5th Street, and his assistant called me back within 2 hours of my message. But before I saw Franklin Reeves, I did 2 things on my own. First, I went to my bank and I met with a woman named Sandra in the accounts department, and I quietly, without any drama, changed certain account structures and updated my beneficiary designations. Sandra was professional and asked no questions, and I appreciated her for it. Second, I went through every piece of paper in Gerald's old filing cabinet. Every deed, every insurance document, every record of the house's improvements since 1987. And I made copies of everything, and I put the copies in a fireproof box that I stored at Ruth's house. Then I saw Franklin Reeves. He was a quiet, careful man who wore small wire-rimmed glasses and who listened to me for 45 minutes and asked precise questions and said nothing reassuring until he was certain it was true. At the end of our meeting, he outlined what he could do. He told me the timeline. He told me what I would need to document. I left his office feeling something I had not felt in months. Ready. The first official step happened on a Wednesday in October, 2 weeks after my initial meeting with Franklin Reeves. I returned to his office at 10 in the morning. The leaves on 5th Street were red and gold, and I remember thinking that Gerald had always loved October, that he would have found all of this, the legal maneuvering, the strategy, deeply satisfying. He was a chess player. I had learned from him. Franklin had prepared a new will. He'd also prepared a durable power of attorney document that named Ruth as my primary agent and Franklin's office as secondary, not Brad. The will itself was thorough and specific. The house, the savings account, the pension's survivorship provisions. And it directed the bulk of my estate to 3 places: the county library system where I had worked for 30 years, a scholarship fund at the local high school established in Gerald's name, and a small animal rescue organization Ruth had volunteered with for years. There was a modest specific bequest for Brad. Modest. Franklin had suggested something symbolic was legally tidier than a complete exclusion, and I had agreed. I signed everything. The assistant notarized it. I shook Franklin's hand and drove home feeling strangely light, the way you feel after a long illness finally breaks. What I did not know, sitting in that car in October, was that Brad had already made his own legal inquiries. I learned this in November. The way I learned it was almost banal, which is often how the most important things arrive. I had a doctor's appointment, routine, a check of my blood pressure and thyroid levels, nothing concerning. My doctor is a woman named Patricia Chen, who has been my physician for 14 years, and who, I have always sensed, possesses an unusually well-calibrated radar for uncomfortable situations. At the end of the appointment, as I was buttoning my coat, she mentioned, carefully, that she had received a phone call. "From your son," she said. I looked at her. "He was asking," she continued, measuring each word, "whether there were any concerns about your cognitive function. He referenced a possible need for a formal capacity assessment." She paused. I told him that I had no such concerns and that any formal assessment would require your consent. I also told him that I would be documenting the call. She looked at me steadily. I thought you should know. I sat back down. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside in the hallway, someone was laughing about something. Thank you, Patricia, I said. Please do document it. I drove home slowly. The trees were nearly bare now, just the last stubborn leaves holding on. I turned into Sycamore Drive and sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. A cognitive capacity assessment. If a court had found me incompetent, or even partially diminished, Brad could have moved for guardianship, legal guardianship. He would have controlled my finances, my housing decisions, my medical care. He could have moved me to Meadow Pines or anywhere else and managed my assets in my interest until I died. I was not diminished. I was furious. And fury, I have found, is one of the clearest signs of a perfectly functioning mind. I called Franklin Reeves from my kitchen that afternoon and told him about Patricia's call. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "This is useful, Marjorie. This establishes intent. I want you to start keeping a log, dates, conversations, anything that documents a pattern of behavior designed to undermine your autonomy. Will you do that?" I already had my yellow legal pad out. That evening, I also called Ruth and told her. She said several things I will not repeat here, because Ruth, when provoked, has the vocabulary of a retired sailor, which I have always found bracing and appropriate. But here is what the doctor's call really meant, sitting there in my kitchen with the notepad in front of me. It meant they were not waiting. They were building a case in parallel. While I was quietly rearranging my legal architecture, Brad and Tiffany were doing the same thing from the other direction. A capacity assessment, a care facility reservation already made, and Derek, the financial advisor, appearing casually, suggesting trust structures and asset management. They had been working on this for longer than I'd realized. I added Dr. Chen's account to my log. I noted the date, the time, Patricia's exact words as best I could reconstruct them, and her confirmation that she would document the call independently. Then I went out to the garden in the cold November air, and I deadheaded the last of the roses. Because the garden still needed tending, and because some things you do simply because they are right, and because the roses do not care about any of the rest of it. Point of no return. I had passed it without looking back. December arrived quietly the way it does in Ohio, not with a single cold snap, but with a slow gray settling, the sky lowering itself like a lid. I spent the first week of December making final preparations. I confirmed with Franklin that all documents were properly filed and recorded with the county. I confirmed with my bank that the account structures were updated and that a specific fraud alert notation had been added to my file. I confirmed with Ruth that the fireproof box at her house contained everything it needed to contain. And then, on the 8th of December, Brad called. He had found out. I don't know exactly how. Possibly through Derek, the financial advisor, who may have run a title search on the property and found that I had updated the deed's transfer on death designation. Possibly through someone at the bank, though Sandra had been careful. It doesn't matter. He had found out that something had shifted, and he did not bother to disguise his alarm. "Mom," he said, and his voice had a tight, controlled quality I recognized as the voice he used when he was frightened of something and trying to appear as though he was not. "I've been hearing some things about legal changes. I just want to make sure no one has taken advantage of you." "No one has taken advantage of me," I said, "because there are people who target seniors, people who..." Brad, I said. I know what I've done and I know why. A pause. Then Tiffany's voice came onto the line. She'd been on speaker, apparently, the whole time. Marjorie, we're just worried about you. We care about you. We don't want to see you make decisions that could hurt you. I appreciate that, I said. Is there anything else? There was a silence that lasted a full 4 seconds. I counted. We're coming over, Brad said. They arrived 40 minutes later. Tiffany was wearing a gray coat and an expression she had clearly rehearsed on the drive over. Concerned, reasonable, loving. Brad's jaw was tight. They sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we had had pot roast in March, and Brad put his hands flat on the surface and looked at me with something that had moved past worry and into threat. Whatever you've been told by whoever you've been talking to, he said, you need to understand that as your son, I have your best interests at heart. I don't doubt that you believe that, I said. We think you should cancel whatever you've set up with this lawyer. I won't be doing that. Tiffany leaned forward. Marjorie, we could contest a new will, you know. If there's evidence of undue influence from a third party, a lawyer who approached you, a neighbor who's been filling your head with... Ruth has known me for 30 years, I said. Franklin Reeves came to me by referral. You are welcome to contest anything you like in court. That is your legal right. Brad stood up. The chair scraped back hard against the tile. You are making a serious mistake. You are going to regret this. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Oliver had retreated under the armchair again. I looked at my son. I thought about the 41 days of Gerald's dying and how Brad had visited 3 times. I thought about the sunflower stickers on Tiffany's envelopes. I thought about the cognitive capacity assessment phone call to my doctor and the brochure for Meadow Pines sitting in my kitchen drawer with a move-in date of December 26th. I understand exactly what you're saying, I said. I think you should go home now. They went, not gracefully. Brad knocked his coat off the hook by the door and didn't pick it up. Tiffany's heels were very loud on the porch steps. I stood in the kitchen after they left and I noticed that my hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, exactly, from adrenaline and from something older. The grief of recognizing fully and without any remaining ambiguity that my son was willing to threaten me in my own kitchen. I called Ruth. She came over within 10 minutes and we sat at the kitchen table and she made tea and she did not say anything falsely optimistic, which was what I needed. I took 3 days. I did not call anyone. I walked my miles each morning. I sat with Oliver in the evenings. I let myself be sad and then I let the sadness finish. On the 4th day, I got up and I confirmed my Christmas plans. The offer came by letter. This surprised me, actually. I had expected another phone call, another kitchen confrontation, more of Brad's frightened aggression. Instead, on the 15th of December, a typed letter arrived in my mailbox. No sunflower sticker. A clean white envelope with Brad's return address printed in a font I didn't recognize, which suggested to me that someone, possibly Derek, possibly a lawyer of their own, had helped compose it. The letter was 3 pages long. It opened with expressions of love and concern. It described at length how difficult it was for Brad to watch his mother aging alone in a large house, how frightening it was to imagine something happening to me without anyone nearby, how much he and Tiffany wanted to ensure my safety and dignity in my remaining years. The language was careful, therapeutic almost. The word dignity appeared 4 times. The offer was this. If I agreed to sell the house and move to an independent living community of my choosing, Brad would withdraw any legal considerations and would ensure that the proceeds were held in an account that I could access with full transparency. He would take nothing. He simply wanted me to be safe. I read the letter twice at Gerald's desk. Then I read it a third time, slowly, the way you read something when you know the real message is somewhere underneath the visible one. Full transparency. The account would be held jointly. There would be a trust structure, which Derek had already outlined, of my choosing, but with his approval, naturally, for reasons of practicality. The house would be sold in a strong market. The proceeds would be managed. I would have access. The word access and not the word control. It was a very well-written letter. If I had been frightened or lonely or uncertain or tired, if I had been any of the things they had spent the last year trying to make me, I might have read it as a kindness, an exit from the conflict, a way to have my son back. I set the letter down and sat for a while. Here is the thing about cold calm. It is not the absence of feeling. It is what is left after you have felt everything thoroughly and come out the other side. I had done my 3 days of grief. I understood what my son was. I understood what the letter was. And I felt, sitting at that desk, something very close to pity. Not the soft, yielding kind, but the harder kind that comes from clarity. I called Franklin Reeves and read him the letter over the phone. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Keep it, date it. It goes in the file." I kept it, I dated it. Then I called Dr. Patricia Chen and asked her to formally document, in my medical record, a statement of her professional assessment of my current cognitive function. She said she would do so willingly and immediately. She also asked how I was doing. I told her the truth, which was that I was doing better than she might expect. "I believe it," she said. "You strike me as a woman who is very difficult to rattle." I thanked her for that. I meant it. And then I did something I had not done in several months. I went to book club. It met on the third Thursday of December at a woman named Helen's house, and there were 7 of us around her living room, and we were supposed to be discussing a novel about a family navigating a difficult inheritance, which struck me that evening as either a great irony or a great gift. I didn't share the details of my own situation, but when the conversation turned, as it inevitably does, to questions of aging and autonomy and what happens when families disagree about what is best for someone, I said a few things, carefully, honestly. The room was quiet afterward, and then a woman named Donna, who was 68 and had spent 30 years as a social worker before retiring, looked at me and said, "If you ever need someone to sit with you at a legal appointment or just to have in your corner, you call me." I looked at her. "I may take you up on that," I said. She nodded once. Good. I drove home through the December dark feeling something I can only describe as held. Not alone, witnessed. There is a particular kind of courage that exists not in isolation, but in a network of people who look at you and see you clearly and stay anyway. Brad and Tiffany did not call that week. They were regrouping. I knew that. I let them regroup. I had 18 days until Christmas. They came on a Sunday, the 20th of December. No call ahead. I heard the car in the driveway and looked through the kitchen window and saw Brad's Buick and felt, for just a moment, the old reflex. The mother instinct that says he came. It's all right. Everything is fine now. The reflex is powerful and it is worth understanding. It is not stupidity. It is 38 years of love finding its groove, even when the groove no longer leads anywhere good. I put the kettle on because I was not going to be caught without hospitality. They came in smiling. Tiffany was carrying a poinsettia in a foil-wrapped pot, which was either a peace offering or a prop. I suspected the latter because she set it on the counter with the label facing outward in a way that seemed practiced. Brad hugged me, briefly, tightly, the way you hug someone you are trying to remind of their obligation to you. We sat in the living room. The Christmas lights were on. Oliver stayed on the arm of my chair and watched them with the patient contempt of a cat who has decided something. We wanted to apologize. Brad began. The other week, I was out of line. I was scared and I said things I shouldn't have. I nodded. And I want you to know, he continued, that whatever you've set up legally, we respect your right to do that. He stopped, looked at his hands. We miss you, Mom. We want this to be okay between us. It was well done, sincerely done even. I think some part of Brad did miss something, some version of me, some version of us. Tiffany had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at me with an expression she had clearly decided was warm. I'm glad you came, I said, and meant some portion of it. And then, as I had known it would, the conversation shifted. Tiffany said gently. Everything she said that afternoon she said gently, like water wearing at stone, that she understood I had concerns about my future, and that those concerns were valid, and that she and Brad had been talking, and they wanted to suggest something different, not Meadow Pines. They understood that had been, she paused, abrupt. But what if I were to come and live with them? They had the spare bedroom. It would be temporary just to see how it felt. Brad could handle the house, manage it, rent it perhaps, keep the income for me, or sell it in the spring when the market peaked. My finances would be my own, of course. But they could help me manage them, just to take the stress off. We're your family, she said. Who else is going to look out for you? I looked at the poinsettia on the counter with its label facing out. That's a generous offer, I said. You don't have to decide right now, Brad said quickly. If I came to live with you, I said conversationally, as though I were considering it genuinely, what would happen with the house? A very slight hesitation. Well, we'd need to address that practically, since you wouldn't be living here. And my accounts? We'd just be helping you. And the will I've already filed with the county? Silence. Tiffany's hands, still folded in her lap, tightened slightly. I watched her knuckles. Marjorie, she said. And the gentleness had a new undertone now, the way water sounds just before it goes over the edge of something. We are trying to be your family here. We are trying to give you an out, because what you're doing, what that lawyer has helped you set up, is going to hurt people. It's going to damage this family in ways that can't be repaired. And I think you know that. And I think you're choosing that deliberately. And I think that is a very sad thing for a mother to do to her child. The room was quiet. Oliver looked at Tiffany. Then Oliver looked at me. I said, I think you should go home. Brad stood up. He was not angry this time. He was cold, which was worse. This is the last time we try, he said. Whatever happens after Christmas is on you. After they left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the Buick back out of the driveway. My heart was beating a little faster than usual. I noticed it the way you notice weather. But fear is information. and what it told me was simple. They were out of options. 6 days until Christmas. Christmas morning arrived with snow. Not heavy, just a fine light dusting that settled on the garden and the bare rose canes and made the lawn look like something from a greeting card. I was up at 6. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the light come up gray and white over Sycamore Drive. Oliver sat on the windowsill and observed the snow with philosophical interest. I had slept well. I want to record that. I had slept well on Christmas Eve, and I had woken up composed and calm and with a very clear sense of what the day would contain. I had Ruth's number in my phone, ready. I had Donna's number. I had Franklin Reeves's office number and his cell, which he had given me for exactly this kind of eventuality. And I had the envelope. I had made myself a proper breakfast that morning. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee with cream, because I believed that the body deserves steadiness on difficult days. I set the table for one, sat down, and ate slowly. I looked out at the snow. I thought about Gerald the way I often do on Christmas morning, not with the sharp grief of the early years, but with something gentler now. A kind of warm accompaniment, the sense of someone standing just to the left of my field of vision. I thought he would have found all of this extraordinary. He would have made a pot of his terrible strong coffee and sat at that desk with the legal papers spread out and read every word twice with great pleasure. I washed my dishes. I got dressed. I put on the pearl earrings Gerald gave me on our 25th anniversary because some days deserve that kind of punctuation. Brad and Tiffany arrived at noon precisely. She was in the red dress again, the same one from last year, which struck me as either economical or theatrical. Brad was in a blazer. They brought a bottle of wine and Tiffany carried it the way you carry something you have decided in advance is a gesture. We ate. I had made a small ham, green beans, rolls. We talked about Christmas traffic and about Tiffany's sister's children. We talked about the snow. Brad had 2 glasses of wine and became easier, the way he always did. And for an hour, the table was almost ordinary. Almost. I cleared the plates. We moved to the living room. I had put Brad's gifts under the tree. Modest things, a cashmere scarf, a book I thought he might actually read. I gave them out. Tiffany had bought me lotion in a scent I don't care for. And then Brad reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. He produced the white envelope. He held it out to me, and the smile, that new smile, the wide, satisfied one, was exactly as I had known it would be, identical to how it had appeared in my imagination for 3 months, like a scene I had rehearsed until the blocking was perfect. "Mom," he said, "your gift this year is a little different." I took it. I opened it. Meadow Pines. The brochure, the confirmed reservation, the move-in date of December 26th. "You're going to love it," Tiffany said and laughed. I set the brochure on the coffee table very gently. I looked at Brad's face. I looked at Tiffany's face. I held their eyes for a moment, not in challenge, not in anger, just steadily. The way you look at something you have understood completely and no longer fear. Then I reached into my handbag, which was sitting on the side table where I had placed it that morning, and I took out my envelope. It was a large manila envelope, sealed and labeled. I held it out to Brad the same way he had held out his to me. He took it slowly. He opened it slowly, and I watched his face as he read. Inside was a letter from Franklin Reeves on firm letterhead. It outlined clearly that a new will had been filed with the county on October 9th, that the power of attorney had been updated with Ruth as primary agent, and that any previous informal understandings or expectations regarding the estate of Marjorie Ann Ellis were superseded by these documents. It noted the existence of a formal log of incidents dating from March of the previous year, including the undocumented call to Dr. Patricia Chen requesting a cognitive capacity assessment. It noted that Dr. Chen had provided a written professional statement attesting to my full cognitive function. It advised that any legal challenge would be met with this documentation, and it thanked Brad briefly for his interest in my welfare. The room was very quiet. Brad read it once. Then he read it again. His face went through several things rapidly. White, then a kind of grayish red, then something flatter and more frightening. "You planned this," he said. "Yes," I said. "How long ago?" "Since September?" Tiffany took the letter from him and read it, and when she put it down, her voice had changed entirely. The gentleness was gone. "Do you understand what you're doing? Do you actually understand? You're throwing away your relationship with your son over, what, some lawyer who talked you into—" "No one talked me into anything," I said. "I made decisions. They are my decisions to make. I am 72 years old and I am in full possession of my faculties, as Dr. Chen will confirm in writing." "You can't do this," Brad said, and his voice broke slightly on the last word in a way that would have undone me once. "I'm your son." "You are," I said, "and I love you. And you tried to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized without my consent in order to access my estate. Both of those things are true at the same time." Tiffany stood suddenly and crossed to the window, and I could see her composing herself, hands tight at her sides, her reflection faint in the dark glass. When she turned back, her voice had dropped to something harder. "You have no idea what it costs to care about someone who won't be helped," she said. "You've made yourself impossible. You've pushed everyone away. And when you're alone, completely alone, don't expect us to come back." I looked at her calmly. "I have Ruth," I said. "I have Donna. I have Patricia. I have a book club and a library and a garden. I am not alone. I am simply not surrounded by the right people." The Christmas lights blinked along the mantel. "This isn't over," she said. "I know," I said. "My lawyer is available Monday." They left without the wine bottle. I stood at the living room window and watched the Buick move down Sycamore Drive and turn at the corner and disappear. The snow was still falling, lightly, steadily. Oliver jumped up onto the back of the couch beside me, and we watched the street together for a while. Then I called Ruth. "Well?" she said before I'd said a word. "It went exactly as expected," I said. I heard her exhale. "Merry Christmas, Marjorie." "Merry Christmas, Ruth." I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat in Gerald's chair by the fire. Not his, literally, but the one I had always thought of as his, because he sat in it every evening for 22 years. And I allowed myself to feel, fully, what had just happened. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter than triumph. A closing. The sense of a door gently and firmly shut. I sat there for a long time. The fire settled. Oliver moved from the couch to my lap with the complete confidence of an animal who has never doubted his welcome. I thought about the March afternoon when Brad had first mentioned the house's market value over pot roast, and how something small and cold had lodged in me then, a splinter I couldn't quite locate. I thought about Tiffany's sunflower stickers. I thought about Derek and his sockless loafers in November. I thought about the 41 days of Gerald's dying and Brad's 3 visits, and how I had forgiven that without ever naming it. The way you forgive small failures in people you love without tallying them, until the tally becomes impossible to ignore. I had named it now. I had put it in a file with a date on it. And that, I understood, was the difference between what I had been and what I had become. On December 28th, Franklin Reeves received a letter from an attorney representing Brad Ellis, contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence. Franklin had told me to expect this. He received the letter with complete equanimity and responded within 48 hours with a package of documentation. The log of incidents with dates and descriptions, Dr. Chen's written professional assessment, the records of Brad's financial advisor's unsolicited visits, a copy of the letter Brad had sent in mid-December with its offer of managed finances, and the independent notarization records confirming that I had been alone, without any third party present, when I signed my new will in October. He also included a note advising Brad's attorney that the phone call to Dr. Chen requesting a capacity assessment, made without my knowledge or consent, constituted an attempt to build a false medical record and could be subject to its own legal scrutiny. Brad's attorney responded once, then did not respond again. By mid-January, the contest had been withdrawn. I learned this from Franklin on a Tuesday morning, and I thanked him and we shook hands. He in his wire-rimmed glasses, me in my winter coat, and I walked out to my car and sat in it for a moment in the parking lot on 5th Street, and I thought, Gerald, you would have been entertained by all of this. I said it aloud, quietly, to no one in particular, and then I started the car and drove to the library because it was Tuesday, and that is what I do on Tuesdays, and some things are worth protecting precisely because they are ordinary. In February, I received notification from Brad's attorney that my son was formally ending contact. The letter was careful and legal in its language. He was not returning calls or correspondence. That was the word the letter used, correspondence, as though 38 years of a life together were a business relationship being wound down. I read the letter. I put it in the file. I went to the library on Tuesday. But something else happened in February, too, something I had not anticipated. A woman from Brad's neighborhood, someone Tiffany had apparently told her version of events to, reached out to a mutual acquaintance who reached out to Donna from my book club. The story that reached me back through this chain was that Tiffany had told people I was unstable, that a lawyer had gotten to me, that Brad had tried to help his aging mother and been cruelly rejected. Donna called me and told me this with the precise factual neutrality of a retired social worker. I said, "Let them say what they like." "I just wanted you to know," Donna said. "I know," I said, "and I know what the documents say." What I had learned in those months was this: other people's stories about you are only dangerous if you have no story of your own. I had mine. It was dated, notarized, witnessed, and filed with the county of Franklin, Ohio. Tiffany's version existed in a chain of neighborhood gossip. The two were not equivalent. And people, in my experience, eventually understand the difference between a story that adds up and a story that simply asks to be believed. In March, I had the garden assessed. I put in 3 new rose varieties Gerald would have liked. Ruth helped me plant them on a Saturday in late April. the two of us in the dirt with our gloves on and Oliver supervising from the porch, and it was one of the better mornings I'd had in some time. The house on Sycamore Drive was mine. The savings account was mine. My Tuesdays at the library were mine. My book club, my garden, my cat, my herb garden, my morning walks. All of it mine, and uncontested and intact. I had not been moved to Meadow Pines. I had moved no one anywhere. I had simply refused to be moved. Spring came, and with it the particular lightness that follows a long winter. I turned 73 in April, and Ruth organized a small dinner, just 6 of us, at Helen's house, with a lemon cake that was better than any restaurant cake I have had in recent memory. Donna was there. Patricia Chen came, which surprised and touched me. We sat around the table for 3 hours and nobody talked about wills or real estate or family conflict. We talked about books and gardens and a trip Helen was planning to Portugal and whether the library should expand its seed lending program. I drove home that night with the windows down a little, even though it was barely warm enough for that, and I thought, this is my life. This is the actual shape of it. And what a shape it was! Not the shape I had imagined at 30 or at 50 or even at 65, standing at Gerald's grave in the November wind, thinking about what came next. It was smaller in some ways and larger in others. Quieter in the places that used to be loud, and surprisingly full in the places I had expected to find only absence. I had learned something that year that I wished someone had told me earlier, that a life can be rebuilt at 73 with the same materials available at any other age. Honesty, good legal counsel, and the right people around a Thursday evening table. I want to be clear about what happened to Brad and Tiffany, because it matters that I did not cause it. I did not engineer their difficulties. What I did was refuse to rescue them from the consequences of who they already were. In June, I learned through Ruth, who had a cousin who worked in the same insurance company where Brad was employed, that Brad had been passed over for a senior management position he had expected and had taken it badly. He'd become difficult at work in the aftermath, argumentative with his supervisor, and had been formally cautioned. I did not know the details and did not seek them, but the picture that assembled itself was consistent with what I knew of him. Brad under pressure became first angry, then brittle, then self-defeating. Tiffany had told too many people her version of the Christmas story. The problem with a story that doesn't hold up to scrutiny is that people eventually scrutinize it. Several people in their social circle knew me through the library, through the garden club, through mutual acquaintances who had known Gerald. And when Tiffany's version reached them, they had questions she couldn't answer. The questions themselves were enough. She had fewer friends by autumn than she'd had in the winter. Their house, I was told, had needed significant repairs that year. The roof, the furnace. Expenses they had evidently been planning to offset with resources that were no longer available to them. I had not thought much about their finances before. I thought about them even less now. But the absence of my house and my savings from their calculations appeared to have left a gap that their actual income did not comfortably fill. They had built a life, I understood, on an expectation. And expectations, when they are built on someone else's property, have a way of collapsing when that person declines to cooperate. I did not feel satisfied by this in any simple way. Satisfaction would have required more feeling than I had left to spend on them. What I felt was something more like completion. The recognition that choices have weight, and that the weight distributes itself eventually to those who made the choices, regardless of what they expected would absorb the impact. My own life, meanwhile, was filling itself in ways I hadn't entirely anticipated. I began leading a weekly readers group at the library for adults with low vision, something that had been understaffed for years and that I'd heard about through the Tuesday volunteers. I discovered sitting in that circle of people with their large print books and their audio devices and their patient, concentrated attention that this was work I was good at and that it mattered in small, concrete ways. One woman, a retired school teacher named Bev, who had lost most of her central vision to macular degeneration, told me one Thursday in September that our sessions were the part of her week she looked forward to most. I drove home from that particular Thursday with something warm and solid sitting in my chest that I recognized after a moment as purpose. Plain, unheroic, reliable purpose. I had missed it without knowing I had missed it. Donna and I had lunch every other Thursday at a diner we both liked. We talked about books, about her years as a social worker, about her late mother and my late Gerald. We were, I realized, becoming actual friends, not just acquaintances from the same Thursday evening gathering. Ruth and I planted the late tulip bulbs together in October. We went to a farmer's market in November. We watched a film on her television one Friday, and she fell asleep before the end, and I covered her with the blanket from the back of her couch and let myself out quietly. And that small domestic act, the covering of a friend with a blanket, the quiet closing of a door, felt like a life well made. Brad did not call. I did not call Brad. There was grief in that. Real grief. Not the clean kind, but the complicated kind that has no resolution and simply requires carrying. I was 73 years old and my son had tried to have me institutionalized, and I still loved him. In the way you love someone from whom something essential has been permanently removed. The love was a fact, like the color of his eyes as a child, like the smell of rain on the garden. It didn't require me to do anything with it. I was not waiting for anything. I was living. They say blood is thicker than water, but blood cannot be used as a reason to let someone drain you dry. I learned this. Love your children, but never confuse love with surrender. Stay in your own house, in your own name, on your own terms, for as long as you are able, and make sure the papers say so. I learned this too. The women around a Thursday evening table may save your life. What would you have done in my place? I'd truly like to know. Leave a comment below. And if this story reached you, please subscribe. Thank you for listening. I never told my son about my $90,000 a month salary. His wife said, "She is broke. Why do we need such a mother-in-law?" My son agreed and threw me out. A week later, I bought the house across the street. When they saw me inside, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Harlow. Most people called me Peg. I was 64 years old, a widow for 11 years, and I had built a life that would have surprised anyone who saw me at the grocery store in my sensible shoes and my old rain jacket, carefully checking the prices on canned soup. That was the point, really. I had never needed anyone to know. I worked as a senior financial consultant for a private wealth management firm in Atlanta. I had been with them for 22 years. My monthly income after taxes was just over $90,000. I owned my home outright, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood in Dunwoody, and I had investments that my colleagues, frankly, envied. I drove a 7-year-old Honda CR-V. I clipped coupons out of habit. I grew tomatoes in the backyard and made my own jam every August, just as my mother had taught me. My husband Robert had died of a stroke in 2013. We had one son together, Daniel Robert Harlow. He was the best thing I had ever done with my life, and I say that not as a sentiment, but as a fact I had held on to through 11 years of quiet evenings and empty Sundays. Daniel had always been a gentle boy, thoughtful, a little soft at the edges perhaps. Robert used to worry about that. But he had grown into a decent man, a project manager at a construction firm, kind to waitstaff and patient with strangers. He called me every Sunday. He brought me soup when I had the flu in January of 2022. He still kissed me on the cheek at the door. Then he met Crystal. Her name was Crystal Vance, and she had come into Daniel's life at a birthday party for a mutual friend in the spring of that year. She was 34, pretty in a sharp, deliberate way, with nails that were always freshly done and an eye for brand names that I noticed immediately. She worked in real estate, which she mentioned within the first 4 minutes of meeting me. She shook my hand with a smile that showed all her teeth and none of her eyes. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I invited her to Sunday dinners. I remembered her food preferences. No red meat, no cilantro. I asked about her listings, her clients, her ideas for the wedding. I bit my tongue when she interrupted Daniel mid-sentence at the table. I told myself it was nerves. New family, it takes time. They married in October of 2022. I paid for a portion of the wedding quietly through Daniel because Crystal had made it clear she wanted an elegant event, and Daniel's salary alone wouldn't cover elegant. I gave them $20,000 as a gift and said nothing about it to anyone. The first real warning came at Thanksgiving. We were at their new house, a 4-bedroom in Marietta that stretched their finances considerably. Crystal had decorated it beautifully, I'll give her that. But somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, she made a remark about my rain jacket, the old green one I'd worn to the door. "Peg, honey," she said, in that particular tone women use when they want to cut you and call it concern. "I know a great consignment shop in Buckhead if you ever need to update your wardrobe. No shame in it." Daniel laughed nervously. I smiled and said nothing. The remarks became a pattern over the following months. My car was so practical. My house was cozy. My job, and here was the one that stung most, was described at a dinner party as something in finance, I think? Some kind of office work. She said it to her friends while I was standing 6 feet away, holding a glass of white wine I hadn't touched. I still didn't say anything about my salary. I had never been that kind of person, but I started paying attention. I noticed how Crystal spoke to Daniel when she thought I wasn't listening, the way she redirected his opinions mid-conversation, the way his shoulders curved inward when she looked at him a certain way. I noticed that the Sunday phone calls grew shorter, then less frequent, then stopped altogether in the early months of 2023. I told myself it was a phase. Newlyweds find their footing, give them space. Then came the evening of March 14th, 2023. Daniel called me. Not on a Sunday, on a Wednesday, at 8 in the evening. His voice was flat in the way that told me he was reading from a script, or at least from something he'd rehearsed. He said Crystal felt that our relationship had become a source of stress in their marriage. He said she felt I was too present, he said, and here I heard Crystal's exact cadence in his borrowed words, that it might be better if I gave them more space, a lot more space, that perhaps holiday dinners weren't working, that perhaps going forward we should communicate through text rather than visits. I asked him if this was what he wanted. There was a pause that lasted 4 full seconds. I counted. "It's what's best for us right now, Mom." I said I understood. I said goodnight. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long time, looking at the tomato plants on the windowsill that had just begun to sprout for the season. A week later, I received a handwritten note in the mail, Crystal's handwriting. I recognized the looping, oversized cursive from birthday cards. Margaret. Daniel and I have spoken. I think we both know you don't exactly fit into the life we're building. I say this kindly. We need a mother-in-law who can contribute to this family in meaningful ways. I hope you understand. Contribute in meaningful ways. I read it 3 times. I set it on the counter next to the phone. Then I went to my filing cabinet, found the folder labeled Daniel, wedding gift, and looked at the receipt for $20,000. Then I opened my laptop and checked my investment portfolio. I sat with that for a while. And then, for the first time in 11 years of widowhood, I allowed myself to feel something I had spent a long time avoiding. Not grief, not loneliness, anger. I did not cry that night. I had done my crying in other seasons. By Robert's hospital bed, at his graveside in November rain, in the first year of silence after, when I would set 2 coffee cups out of habit and then stand there looking at the second one. I had learned how grief moved through a body and came out the other side. This was not grief. This was something cleaner, and in some ways, more useful. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and I did what I had done with every major problem in my professional life for 22 years. I made a list. On the left side of the page, I wrote what I have lost. On the right side, I wrote what I still have. The left side filled quickly. My Sunday calls with Daniel. The easy assumption that I would be present for his milestones, future anniversaries, future children if they came, the ordinary fabric of a family life that I had taken for granted the way you take for granted a door that has always been unlocked. I wrote down the $20,000 I had given them for the wedding, not because I wanted it back, but because I needed to see it clearly, without sentiment obscuring the number. I wrote down the letter, E. Then I moved to the right side. My health, which was good, my work, which I was excellent at, my home owned free and clear, my savings, my investments, my professional relationships, my network, my own name, which still carried weight in Atlanta financial circles, my reputation, which was spotless, my mind, which was as sharp as it had ever been. I looked at both columns for a long time. Then I wrote one line at the bottom of the page, underlined twice. She thinks she knows what I'm worth. She doesn't. That was the beginning. I want to be clear about what I was not planning to do. I was not planning to punish Daniel. I loved my son. Whatever he had become inside that marriage, whatever quiet erosion had taken place in him, I believed the man I had raised was still somewhere inside him. I was not interested in revenge in any theatrical sense. I was not going to call his workplace or spread gossip or do anything that would embarrass him. What I was interested in was presence, visibility, making it impossible for Crystal Vance to define my worth in absentia, to write me off as an irrelevance, to tell her friends over dinner that her mother-in-law was something in finance while I sat in my sensible shoes and said nothing. The idea came to me on a Saturday morning in late March while I was walking the dog, a 10-year-old beagle named Gerald, around the neighborhood. I had driven to Daniel and Crystal's street in Marietta 3 times in the weeks since the letter, not stopping, just driving slowly, which I am not particularly proud of. But on that 3rd drive, I had noticed something. The house directly across the street from theirs was for sale. It was a 4-bedroom colonial, slightly larger than their own, with a wide front porch and mature oak trees in the yard. The lawn had gone a little dry. The owners had clearly moved out already. The windows had that vacant, hollow quality. There was a lockbox on the front door and a blue for sale sign from a Marietta Realty office stuck in the ground near the mailbox. I pulled over. I wrote down the number. That afternoon, I called my own realtor, a woman named Donna Fredericks, whom I had worked with twice before, and who knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. I told her what I was looking at. I told her I wanted a full property report by Monday. "Are you planning to move, Peg?" she asked. "I'm planning to invest," I said, which was true enough. Donna sent me the report Sunday night. The house had been listed for 62 days. The asking price was $485,000. The owners had already dropped it once. The inspection reports were clean. The neighborhood was solid. Good school district, low crime, stable property values. I could buy it outright. I did not make the decision impulsively. I spent the following week running the numbers the way I ran any major financial decision. Methodically, without emotion in the calculation, even if emotion was what had started the engine. I looked at rental income potential. I looked at property appreciation projections for that Marietta zip code over 10 years. I looked at what the house would cost me to maintain versus what it would generate if I put it on the market after 2 years. Every number made sense, but I also knew that was not the whole reason. I thought about Crystal's note on my kitchen counter. "I hope you understand." I thought about Daniel's voice on the phone, flat and rehearsed. I thought about the 4-second pause when I asked him if this was what he wanted. He had been talked out of his own mother. Slowly, methodically, the way you talk someone out of a habit or a loyalty. Not all at once, but by degrees, by accumulated small suggestions, by the steady pressure of someone who had decided that a quiet woman in a rain jacket with a 7-year-old Honda was not worth the trouble. What would happen, I wondered, if that quiet woman bought the house across the street? What would happen when Crystal looked out her front window one morning and saw me on my porch, drinking my coffee in the sunshine, entirely unbothered? I signed the purchase offer on April 3, 2023. I paid $471,000 cash after a small negotiation. Donna handled the paperwork with her characteristic efficiency. I told her I would be moving in by June and that I intended to be a good neighbor. She laughed because she thought I was joking. I was not. In those weeks between signing and closing, I kept my routine. I went to work. I watered my tomatoes. I walked Gerald around the block in the evenings. I did not contact Daniel. I did not respond to Crystal's note, which still sat on my counter. I had decided it would be more useful as a document than as a grievance. But I had started thinking carefully about what came next. Buying the house was step 1. It was a statement, but statements alone don't resolve conflicts. I had been in enough boardrooms to know that. There was more to be done. There were things I needed to understand before I understood how to proceed, including a question I had not yet answered, one that nagged at me on my evening walks with Gerald while the Georgia spring came in warm around us. How much did Crystal actually know about my finances? And where had she gotten her information? The closing was May 28th. I spent the morning in Donna's office signing documents with the focused calm I brought to any transaction of significance, and I was done by 11:30. The keys, 2 of them, on a plain brass ring, went into the front pocket of my handbag. On the drive home, I stopped at a nursery and bought 2 flats of impatiens for the front porch beds. I had not yet told Daniel. This was deliberate. I wanted the house ready or close to it before they knew. Not because I was hiding. Hiding implies shame, and I felt none. But because I had learned in 22 years of financial consulting that timing matters more than almost any other variable. You don't show your hand until the hand is played. My house in Dunwoody had sold quickly. I had listed it quietly in late April, priced to move, and it went under contract in 9 days. I donated a great deal of furniture, kept what I loved, and arranged for movers on June 6th. I had been living leaner than my income for so long that moving felt almost easy. 2 truckloads. Gerald in the front seat of the CRV with his ears flat and his nose working overtime. We arrived at the house on Whitfield Court, Marietta on a Thursday morning. The oak trees were magnificent in the June light. The porch was exactly as wide as I had remembered. I set Gerald down on the front lawn and watched him investigate the grass with the serious concentration he brought to all things. And I stood there in my old rain jacket looking at the house across the street. Their driveway was empty. Crystal's white BMW was gone. Daniel's truck was gone. The neighborhood was quiet. Good. I didn't need an audience yet. In the days of moving and unpacking, arranging furniture, testing light switches, learning which floorboards creaked, I had continued to think about the question that had followed me since March. How much did Crystal know? Or more to the point, what did she think she knew, and how had she come to think it? The note had said, "You don't exactly fit into the life we're building." That was not the language of someone who had simply looked at my car and my jacket and drawn conclusions. That was the language of someone who believed she had done her research. I am very private about my finances. I always have been. My income was not public knowledge. I had never discussed it with Daniel in specific terms, and I certainly hadn't discussed it with Crystal. My home in Dunwoody was modest enough that its value wouldn't signal wealth to anyone who didn't look up the property records. I drove an old car. I dressed plainly. I did not wear jewelry beyond my wedding ring, which I still wore. So where had Crystal gotten the idea that I was, in her assessment, a woman without meaningful resources? I made some inquiries, carefully. I had a longtime friend and former colleague named Beverly Ossie, who had retired 2 years earlier from the same firm, and whose husband, James, happened to be a real estate attorney. Beverly and I had lunches occasionally and kept in the quiet orbit of old professional friendship. When I called her in early June and explained in general terms what had happened, her response was immediate. "Crystal Vance," Beverly said, "in real estate." "Yes." "Peg, give me a couple of days." Beverly called me back on a Thursday evening. She had spoken to James, who had spoken to a colleague, and what they had found was this. Crystal had, at some point in the prior year, run a property search on my Dunwoody address. This was not illegal. Property records are public. But it told a story. She had seen a modest house in a middling neighborhood, purchased in 1998 with no second mortgage, no liens. a house worth approximately $340,000 in the current market. For a woman my age, living alone, that looked like modest circumstances. She had not looked further. She had not looked at my professional profile, my firm's website, my years of service, or anything that might have told her what I actually did or what I actually earned. She had run one search, drawn one conclusion, and apparently decided that was sufficient. I sat with that for a long time. This was not accidental snobbery. This was an assessment. Crystal had looked me up, evaluated me, found me wanting by her particular metrics, and had begun, I now believed from the timeline of events, to systematically work on Daniel's perception of me, not with lies exactly, with framing, with the patient architecture of suggestion. She's not what we need. She can't contribute. She doesn't fit. And Daniel, who had always been soft at the edges, who had never been good at holding his own shape under pressure, had bent. But here was what I found that Thursday evening that changed the quality of my anger entirely. Beverly had also discovered, through James's colleague, through the particular small world efficiency of Atlanta's real estate community, that Crystal had, over the past year, been telling people in her professional network that her mother-in-law was a retired bookkeeper on a fixed income, not just implying it in conversation, saying it to clients, to colleagues, using it as a kind of social currency. The self-made woman unburdened by a needy relative. One of Crystal's clients had mentioned it to someone, who'd mentioned it to a woman who attended the same church as Beverly, who had heard it in a completely different context and only connected the dots after Beverly described the situation. I was being used as a prop, a story. My husband's poor mother, said not with affection but with the particular satisfaction of someone who has established their own position by contrast. I looked at the note again. I hope you understand. I understood perfectly now. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the property listing for 14 Whitfield Court, my new address. It had not yet been updated in the public records. I was still listed as the recent purchaser at a cash price of $471,000. It would be updated soon. And Crystal was still in real estate. She searched property records for a living. When she searched my name, and she would, because people like Crystal always eventually searched, she would find it. The house directly across from hers. Cash purchase. $471,000. I did not need to do anything else to begin. I just needed to wait for her to look. The first sign that she had found it came on a Tuesday. I was on the front porch with my coffee and Gerald 7:30 in the morning when Crystal's white BMW pulled out of their driveway across the street and stopped. Just stopped, engine running in the middle of Whitfield Court. I could not see her face clearly through the windshield at that distance, but I could see the stillness of the car, the quality of pause that belongs to someone who has seen something they were not prepared for. I raised my coffee mug. The BMW sat there for another 15 seconds. Then it pulled away. I went inside and refilled my coffee. I had made the house comfortable in the 3 weeks since moving in. I'd put the things I loved in the places they belonged. Robert's reading chair by the front window, my mother's quilt on the guest bed, the good kitchen knives I'd had for 20 years, the framed photographs on the hallway wall. I had planted the impatiens on the porch and put tomato seedlings in the side yard. Gerald had claimed the living room rug as his personal territory and seemed satisfied with the arrangement. I had been to the office every day. My colleagues at the firm knew I had moved. I'd told them simply that I wanted a change of scenery, which they accepted with the incuriosity of people who respect privacy. My work had not suffered. If anything, the focused determination I had been carrying since March had sharpened my thinking in ways I could feel in client meetings, in the quality of my analysis, in the particular clear-headedness that comes when a person stops spending energy pretending something is fine. On Thursday of that week, they came. I heard their footsteps on the porch steps before the knock, Daniel's heavier tread, Crystal's sharper heel strikes. I had been in the kitchen making lunch. I took my time. I washed my hands, dried them, checked my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. Old habit. And walked to the front door. I opened it before they could knock a second time. Daniel looked terrible. He had lost weight in the months since I'd last seen him, and not in a healthy way. The kind of weight that leaves a face drawn and a jawline too sharp. He was wearing a polo shirt and the expression of a man who had been told exactly what to say and was already forgetting it. Crystal stood half a step behind him and slightly to the right, which placed her in a position of observation without the exposure of the front line. She was wearing a cream blazer, and the smile I had come to think of as her working face. "Mom," Daniel said. I said, "Daniel, Crystal." I did not step back from the doorway. "We didn't know you'd," he started. "Moved?" I said pleasantly. "I bought the house about 2 months ago. It's a good property. Solid bones, mature trees. I'm very happy with it." Crystal's smile had not moved, which meant she was working hard to keep it in place. "Peg," she said, "this is a little unusual, don't you think? Moving across the street from your son without saying anything?" "I didn't realize I needed permission to choose my address," I said. "It's not about permission." She had shifted into the measured cadence she used, I suspected, with difficult clients, calm, patronizing, with the faintest edge of threat beneath the surface. "It's about boundaries, which we discussed." "You sent me a letter," I said. "I kept it. Would you like to see it?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "We discussed giving us space," Crystal continued, "and now you've moved into our neighborhood, across the street from our home." "Crystal." I kept my voice conversational. "I purchased a property on a public street. I paid cash. I'm current on my HOA dues. I'm a quiet neighbor. I go to bed by 10 and I don't throw parties. Is there something specific about my residence here that conflicts with local ordinance?" The smile faltered for just a moment, just a flicker. She had not expected me to be this calm. "This is harassment," she said, and the word landed with the force of something she'd been saving. "Coming here, after everything." "I live here," I said. "You're on my porch." "I could make this very uncomfortable for you," she said, and now the working face was gone. The voice had dropped to something quieter and more deliberate. "I have a professional network in this community. I know people on the HOA board. I could make your life here very difficult if I wanted to." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at Daniel, who was staring at the porch railing. "Daniel," I said quietly, "is this what you want to say to me?" He said nothing. His silence was its own answer. "Crystal," I said, "I want you to hear me clearly. I am 64 years old. I have worked in financial services for 22 years. I have a very good attorney, a very good accountant, and access to both whenever I need them. If you take any action, with the HOA with anyone in this community that constitutes harassment or interference, I will pursue every legal remedy available to me, and I have the time and the resources to do exactly that. I paused. I also want you to know that I've been keeping records since March. All of them. The porch went very quiet. Crystal turned to Daniel. "Let's go," she said. He followed her. He did not look back. I watched them cross the street. I watched their front door close. I stood on my porch a moment longer in the June afternoon heat, listening to the oak trees move. Then I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and for the first time since April 3rd, I felt the weight of it, all of it, settle fully into my chest. Not fear, exactly. Something older. The complicated sorrow of watching your child walk away from you in the company of someone who has taught him not to see you. I gave myself the weekend, that was all. I called Beverly on Friday evening and told her what had happened. I spent Saturday doing nothing more demanding than reading on the porch and deadheading the impatience. Sunday, I walked with Gerald for an hour along the Greenway Trail 2 streets over and let the Georgia morning do what Georgia mornings do in June. Warm and honeysuckle-scented, indifferent to human difficulty in a way that I have always found more comforting than the alternative. By Monday, I was steady again, and I had started thinking about what came next. The summer settled into a rhythm that, from the outside, must have looked unremarkable. I went to work. I tended my garden. I walked Gerald in the mornings and evenings. I introduced myself to my neighbors with the careful, unhurried friendliness of someone who intends to stay. Not effusive, not performative, just present and decent and reliable, the way I had been in every neighborhood I had ever lived in. The woman to my left was named Rita Castellano, retired schoolteacher, 71, who grew dahlias along her fence line with a precision that impressed me professionally. To my right was a couple, the Nkrumah Bells, Kwame and Sandra, both in their early 40s, 2 children, a shared driveway, and a lawnmower they were always willing to lend. At the far end of the street was an older man named Dale Whitmore, who had lived on Whitfield Court for 30 years and considered himself its unofficial historian, a role I encouraged because useful information comes from unexpected sources. I learned from Dale, in the course of 3 front yard conversations over a period of 2 weeks, that Crystal had been on the HOA welcoming committee the previous year and had used the position to cultivate a particular social standing in the neighborhood, that she was known for her parties and her opinions about property aesthetics, that she had once filed a complaint against a neighbor over the height of their hedges. I filed this away. In late July, Crystal came to my door alone. This was different from the June confrontation. I could see that in the way she stood, both hands visible, no rigid shoulders, the working smile replaced by something softer and more carefully constructed. She was wearing a sundress, which was a costume choice. She held a bottle of wine. "I thought we could talk," she said. "Just the 2 of us, woman to woman." I stepped aside and let her in. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had made my list in March, where I had sat with the keys on May 28th, where I had steadied myself after every significant moment in this particular chapter of my life. I made coffee. I did not open the wine. Crystal looked around the kitchen with the trained professional eye of someone calculating square footage and fixture quality. I watched her recalibrate, though she tried not to show it. "This is a beautiful home, Peg," she said, and the admission cost her something. "Thank you, I'm happy here." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and looked at me with an expression she had clearly practiced. Open, a little vulnerable, the look of someone about to offer reconciliation. "I think we started off badly," she said. "I said some things that were unkind. The letter was." A pause. It came from a place of stress. Daniel and I were going through a difficult time. "I see," I said. "I'd like to move forward. I think this situation with you living here, across the street, it doesn't have to be adversarial." "I've never wanted it to be," I said. She smiled, and in that smile I saw the opening of what she had actually come to say. "I think it would be healthier for everyone, for Daniel especially, if things were calm, if you weren't so—" She searched for the word, visible. You know what I mean. There it was, less visible, which meant less present, less real, less of a reminder of what he owes you and what you've given him. She wanted me to lower the flag, to agree to a managed distance that she controlled, to be the quiet woman in the modest house who showed up when summoned and disappeared when inconvenient. "Crystal," I said, "I appreciate you coming over. I mean that. It took courage." She nodded, sensing progress. "But I need you to understand something," I continued, in the same pleasant, unhurried tone I use with clients who have misread a contract. "I'm not going to be less visible. I live here. This is my street, my porch, my garden. I'm going to be present in my own neighborhood, and I'm going to maintain a relationship with my son, even if that relationship has to rebuild itself slowly and on different terms than before. That's not aggression. That's just my life." Her expression shifted. The softness went out of it. "You're making things very hard," she said. "I don't think I am," I said. "I think things are only hard if you've built your peace of mind on the assumption that I would disappear." She stood. She picked up the wine bottle from the counter where she'd set it. "I tried," she said. And there was something genuine in it underneath the calculation. Not remorse, exactly, but the frustration of a strategy that wasn't working. "Yes," I said, "you did." I showed her to the door. After she left, I stood at the front window and watched her cross the street. At the foot of her porch steps, she paused and looked back, and I stepped back slightly from the window, not hiding, just choosing not to give her the satisfaction of seeing me watch. Then I called Beverly and told her what had happened. "Good," Beverly said. "Don't move an inch." "I wasn't planning to," I said. What I didn't tell Beverly, what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that these weeks had given me something I hadn't expected. Rita Castellano had begun stopping by on Saturday mornings with extra dahlias from her garden. Sandra and Kruma Bell had invited me to a neighborhood book club that met on the second Thursday of the month, 3 streets over, in someone's kitchen, with excellent homemade food and frank conversation. Dale had begun including me in his front yard histories of the street, as though I had always been there. I was making a life, a real one. On Whitfield Court, Marietta, Georgia, directly across the street from my son's house, and I could feel, in the way one feels a shift in weather before the clouds arrive, that something was coming. That the quiet of those summer weeks was not peace. It was tension held at a particular pitch, waiting for a resolution that could not be postponed much longer. I just didn't know yet what form it would take. They came on a Saturday morning in early September, both of them, together. Standing on my porch with the careful, neutral expressions of people who have agreed beforehand on their approach. Daniel was carrying a paper bag from the bakery on Canton Road, the one I had liked for years. Inside, I knew without looking, would be the almond croissants I had always ordered on Saturday mornings when he still came to visit. The detail was intended to soften me. We sat in the living room with coffee and croissants, and for the first 20 minutes it was almost normal. Daniel asked about the garden, about Gerald, who arranged himself against his ankle with the trusting shamelessness of a dog who forgives everyone. Crystal admired the front room with the particular quality of admiration that is really appraisal. I poured more coffee and waited. "We've been thinking," Daniel said eventually, in the way he said things when the words were not entirely his. "This situation, the house across from ours, puts pressure on our marriage. Crystal feels watched. There's a tension every time she looks out the window. We thought," Crystal continued, taking her cue, "that maybe a cleaner solution would be for us to help you find something more suitable. There are wonderful 55-plus communities about 20 minutes from here. I could list this house for you and get you a good price. More than you paid, honestly, given what the market's done. Clean, professional, thoroughly prepared. They wanted to sell my house, move me 20 minutes away, and clear the view from their front window." "Daniel," I said, "do you actually want this? For your own reasons, independent of anyone else's opinion?" He looked at Crystal, then looked away. "It would be better for our marriage," he said. "That's not what I asked." The room was quiet. "Crystal," I said pleasantly, "it's a thoughtful offer. The market timing is reasonable." I watched the flicker of satisfaction begin in her face, and continued, "But I'm not going to take it. I'm staying on Whitfield Court." Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened. "I'd also like to say something I've been patient about saying. You told people in your professional network that I was a retired bookkeeper on a fixed income. You researched my Dunwoody property, drew a conclusion, and used it as social currency. A story about why you didn't need to include me. I'm not angry about it anymore. But Daniel deserves to know what was used to justify pushing his mother out of his life." "Mom," Daniel started, "I'm not saying this to fight. I'm saying it because it's true." Crystal stood. The pleasant mask was entirely gone. "You think you're so righteous. Do you have any idea how exhausting you are? How much pressure you put on this family just by existing?" "I suppose I do put pressure on things," I said. "That tends to happen when a load-bearing wall is removed and someone tries to replace it with nothing." She walked out. After a moment, Daniel followed. He paused in the doorway. And I thought, the way I had thought in every moment of silence since March, that he might turn around, that the man I had raised might surface. He stepped off the porch. I stood at the window watching them cross the street, my heart beating harder than I would have liked to admit. There was real fear in it. Crystal was not a woman who absorbed damage quietly, but the fear wasn't softening my resolve. If anything, it was sharpening it. The words were in the air now. Irretrievable. Real. I picked up Gerald from the rug. "All right," I said to him. "Let's see what she does." She moved in October. I had been expecting something. Crystal was too controlled, too strategic to simply stew. She was a woman who solved problems by applying the right institutional lever at the right moment. When the certified letter arrived from the Whitfield Court HOA on October 9th, I was not entirely surprised. The complaint alleged that I had violated HOA aesthetic guidelines by maintaining an inconsistent landscape installation in the side yard, the tomato garden, which allegedly exceeded the permissible height for non-ornamental plantings within 3 feet of a visible property line. It was signed by 3 board members. Crystal's name was not on it, but Crystal was on the welcoming committee, had cultivated those board relationships for 2 years, and the complaint had been filed 11 days after our Saturday morning conversation. I called James Ossie that same evening. James reviewed the HOA's governing documents and called me back at 8:30. Your tomatoes are 41 inches from the property line. The guideline prohibits plantings over 36 inches within 2 feet of the line. Technically, barely a violation. But enforcement precedent in this HOA is essentially non-existent. No one has ever been cited for a garden installation. There are 2 other homes on the street with similar setups. I contest, I said. We requested a hearing at the October 22nd meeting. I brought the HOA documents, a property survey, photographs of both adjacent properties with identical garden setups, and printed minutes confirming 0 prior enforcement actions of this type. The meeting was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, 9 residents plus 4 board members. Crystal sat in the 3rd row with a composure that looked expensive. James presented our case in 12 minutes, polite, thorough, precise. He noted the lack of enforcement precedent, the photographs, the comparable properties. Then he said calmly, "We also want to put on record that this complaint was filed 11 days after my client had a documented private dispute with a neighbor who is an active member of the HOA welcoming committee. We are not alleging improper motive at this time, but the timing is relevant to any consideration of selective enforcement." Phil Garrett, the board chairman, looked uncomfortable. Crystal stood up. "That's a serious accusation. I had nothing to do with this complaint." "You didn't sign it," James acknowledged pleasantly. "I didn't file it. I didn't suggest it." "I'd just like to ask," said Rita Castellano from the 2nd row, in the voice of a woman who has spent 35 years managing classrooms, "did anyone on the board visit the other properties with similar gardens before filing the complaint against Mrs. Harlow?" Silence. "Because I've had a planter box within 2 feet of my fence line for 4 years, Rita continued, "and I've never received a notice." "This is different," Crystal said. "How is it different?" Sandra and Kruma Bell asked from the back. She had come without my asking, so had Dale Whitmore. So had 2 other neighbors whose names I was only just learning. How is it different? 3 words asked quietly, that detonated in that fluorescent-lit room with more force than any accusation. Crystal looked at the board. The board looked at Phil Garrett. Phil Garrett rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I think we table the complaint and review enforcement consistency before any further action." "Phil," Crystal started. "Tabled," he said firmly. "Motion." Seconded in under 5 seconds. I walked out into the October night with Rita and Sandra on either side of me. I breathed the cool air and did not allow myself to feel triumphant. Triumph was premature, but walking back to my house with the oak trees lit amber from the streetlights and Gerald waiting behind the front door, I felt something I hadn't felt since March. Solid ground. The public records updated the second week of October. My purchase, Margaret Ann Harlow, cash $471,000, had been in the county system since closing, but the full entry with my professional designation had only just propagated. Senior Financial Consultant, Harlow and Associates, LLC. Dale Whitmore mentioned it to me on a Tuesday morning with the pleased neutrality of someone delivering significant news. Saw your full listing came through on the county site, he said. Impressive credentials, Peg. The information moved at the pace neighborhoods move, which is faster than most people think. By Thursday, Sandra had mentioned something to Beverly, who had independently encountered Crystal at a community event through a former colleague of mine. A man who introduced himself as knowing Margaret Harlow from Atlanta's wealth management sector. The story Crystal had circulated, retired bookkeeper, fixed income, now met the documented reality of a cash purchase and a 22-year professional profile. The gap between those two things could not be quietly absorbed. No one published anything. No one confronted Crystal publicly. But in the social economy of Whitfield Court, where reputation was currency and Crystal had been spending it freely for 2 years, the recalibration was swift. The HOA welcoming committee met in early November. Crystal was not reappointed. The reason given was restructuring. Daniel called me on a Sunday, the first Sunday call in 8 months. His voice had lost the flat, rehearsed quality of March. I didn't know, he said. I should have known all kinds of things I just didn't want to look at. What are you looking at now? I asked. I talked to Crystal about the things she said about you, to people. His voice was careful. She didn't deny it, said it was taken out of context, but I know what she said, Mom. And I was letting her define things for me because it was easier than deciding anything for myself. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in over a year. I'm not going anywhere, I said. I live across the street. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. We spoke for 40 minutes, about nothing particularly significant. But the 40 minutes themselves were significant, and we both knew it. In December, Crystal filed for a legal separation. I learned this through a standard letter from Daniel's attorney's office requesting documentation for a financial disclosure in which Daniel had listed me as a family member with inheritance relevance. I provided what was requested. I also included in a separate notarized document drafted with James Ossie, a letter of intent designating Daniel Robert Harlow as primary beneficiary of my estate, valued, at current assessment, at just over $2.3 million. I wanted it on record, clearly, without ambiguity. I wanted Crystal's attorney to read that number and understand the full scope of what she had worked so carefully to remove her husband from. I heard through Beverly that she had read it. I heard she had read it more than once. 2 years passed. Not triumphant years. Good ones. The kind that feel like long, steady days adding up to something. Tomatoes in August, coffee on the porch on Saturday mornings. Gerald turning 12 and developing a dignified enthusiasm for napping in new locations. I accepted a senior partnership at the firm that spring, something I had declined twice before. I had spent too long making myself smaller than I was, in professional settings the way I had in personal ones. I was done with that. Daniel and I rebuilt slowly. He moved into a rental after the divorce was finalized in February of the second year. He came for dinner the following November. Roast chicken, the potatoes he'd always liked. We talked until 10 o'clock. He looked lighter, the way people do when they've put down something too heavy, even if the putting down hurt. Standing at the sink after dinner, washing dishes together, he said quietly, "I missed your cooking. I missed you." I handed him a dish to dry. "You know where I live," I said. He laughed, actually laughed. Sunday calls resumed. Sometimes he just came over. He helped with the garden in spring, fixed a loose gutter in January. He mentioned therapy without embarrassment, which struck me as growth all on its own. As for Crystal, I take no pleasure in what followed, because I didn't engineer any of it. The professional damage was real. The neighborhood story traveled the way Atlanta stories travel, through overlapping networks, through professional contacts, through the oral history a community keeps about its members. Her referrals slowed. Her social position on Whitfield Court receded. She moved away at the end of the first year. I heard she was renting. I heard she'd become engaged to someone new, and I genuinely hoped it would go better for her. I mean that as a sincere wish from a woman who knows what it costs to get marriage wrong. The house across the street was eventually bought by a young couple, Marcus and Philippa, both architects, with a toddler and a cat who regarded Gerald with philosophical contempt. I was the first person to bring them a meal after they moved in. My dining room table, where I had sat alone after the letter, where I had made my lists, was now where Daniel came on alternate Sundays, where Beverly and James came for Thanksgiving, where Rita brought her daughter at Christmas, where I hosted for the first time in 11 years a dinner party for 8 people who were my actual chosen arrived at friends. I was exactly where I wanted to be. I learned this. Your worth is not what someone chooses to see. Crystal looked at my car, my jacket, my house, and decided she knew me. She didn't look further because she didn't think I warranted it. That was her mistake. I also learned that quiet endurance is not the same as weakness. But there comes a point where staying quiet becomes complicity in someone else's lie. When that point came, I bought a house. What would you have done? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and share it. And thank you, genuinely, for listening.